Good to see you.
Hello, again, welcome to Iowa Inquiry. I'm Rich Eichner, your host. My guest this week is Cindy Terrell, who is the Executive Director of the Women's Equality Campaign. Cindy, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about the Women's Equality Campaign and why do we need one? What are we campaigning about anyway?
Well, we're campaigning about Amendment Number 1, which is on the ballot this November. It was placed on the ballot by the Iowa State Legislature in 2 separately elected but consecutive legislative sessions, and it was put there or voted by overwhelming margins to adopt the language "and women" to the Iowa State Constitution. The clause currently reads, "All men are by nature free and equal."
I think we have a slate that we can put up so people can read it as you go along.
Sounds good. And so what we are proposing to do is put the amendment into the Iowa Constitution, and voters will have an opportunity to vote on that on November 3rd.
This sounds like a pretty simple thing. Must be everybody agrees with it.
Well, we hope so. So far, actually, we have quite a bit of support out there in the state. People seem to feel pretty good about the concept of equality. Right now, there are 16 states in the country which guarantee constitutional equality between men and women. And if Iowa, or when Iowa, votes to approve this on November 3rd, it will join those other 16 states. And that's something I think that most Americans and most Iowans feel pretty comfortable with, that concept of equality, that what rights men have, women should have those same rights as well.
Well, we've gotten this far. Do we really need it? I mean, is it important to change the language, or is it mostly just kind of a housekeeping chore of some kind?
Well, I think it accomplishes a few things. One, it certainly makes sense to have what 51% of the population represented in the Constitution. So just on the simplistic level of trying to cover all territory, one of the certainly important things in our society is to grant in our democracy as many rights as we can to all people in this country. And that's one thing that it accomplishes, is saying all men and women are free and equal. Pretty harmless thing, but it's an important thing for women out there who may not feel like they're represented in the Constitution, particularly if their name isn't there in that key critical Article 1, Section 1 of the Iowa Constitution. The other thing that we'll do, which perhaps is more important, is that it guarantees constitutional equality for women, which means that all discrimination based on the gender, based on gender, will be banned in Iowa. And that's quite an important thing, because currently there is some discrimination which happens in the area of employment, in the area of athletics, and this is something, this constitutional amendment is something which will guarantee constitutional equality and provide women and girls the opportunity, both athletic and economic, which they really need to live fulfilled lives.
Is it just protecting women and girls, or would it protect men and boys as well?
It protects everyone. It gives everyone the same rights in society. There are certainly laws currently in Iowa which hit women a little harder and some which hit men a little harder. An example of one that would really help men and fathers in this state is the current paternal leave law is pretty discriminatory against men. A man who wants to take paternal leave and go take care of a newborn child or a ill family member cannot do that under Iowa law. It does not get the paid leave that he might need. And under state ERAs and other around the nation, that's something that men have been able to have access to, which I think is an important thing. We want to be supporting the family, and if the woman, for one reason or another, the mother in the instance, is not able to go home and take care of that child, having an ERA in this state would mean that men would more likely be able to get that time off and to have a law that would guarantee that.
I think you said paid leave. Did you mean paid leave or just any leave?
I meant any leave at all, yeah.
So even on an unpaid basis, if the parents just wanted to share responsibilities and alternate for nothing else.
Sure. And I think the other thing that's important to point out is that in this democratic society in which we live, having rights, having equality in a family is an important thing. And certainly in times of an economic recession, women being paid equally for the work they do helps everyone in the family. Almost everyone in this state certainly has either a spouse or a mother or a child who they want to make sure that they are protected under law and that they're going to get fair wages for the work they do, or equal wages for the work they do, and that if they're a girl, say, who wants to play sports, that they have the economic resources there to allow them to do so. And that helps society as a whole, I think, as well.
Mm-hmm. Where does the controversy on this amendment come? Well, before we get to the controversy, let's focus on the Constitution. What's the value of the Constitution in comparison to just having the legislature pass a law of some kind?
Well, that's a good question, I think. One of the things, obviously, that we all know that people really value the Constitution, both at the federal level and the state level. It's the compilation or the composition of all the most basic and important rights that individuals in a state have. And that's why it's so important that women be included in the Iowa State Constitution, because they're presently not. One of the reasons that a constitutional amendment is so important is that it provides a level of protection against discrimination which many laws do not do. There are a lot of loopholes in Iowa state law which exist currently, which would be corrected with a constitutional amendment. And certainly, which is something that's true, is that Iowa state laws can always be changed. They can be rescinded, and a legislature can come in and decide that that these laws aren't applicable anymore, and they can be changed. And that's something that a constitutional amendment would take care of. You can't change. It's hard to change a constitution, as we're finding. It's challenging.
So you're really saying it's a basic statement of principles upon which the rest of the laws kind of build from that foundation.
Right, certainly. It certainly sets a tone for the state.
We started talking about controversy. Why is this controversial, or is it?
Well, you tell me. I can't figure out. You'd think it'd be simple, equality for men and women. I think one of the reasons it's controversial is that people don't really understand how simple it is. There's a lot of misinformation that's being put out into the public by people like Pat Robertson and Phyllis Schlafly and the Eagle Forum. Basically, leaders of organizations from outside, national leaders, coming in to tell Iowans basically a lot of stuff that isn't true about what an equal rights amendment would do.
Why would they do that?
Well, they have, I think, a curious agenda of their own. I think they are quite interested in protecting what they see as their economic interests and their family value interests. I think they represent a very small percentage of Americans who are pretty intolerant of people and the kinds of needs they face, and are pretty intolerant of women who want to be paid equally for the work that they do. And I think they're motivated by almost a zealousness which seems to lead them to tell basically a lot of lies about what the ERA would do, and that's troubling.
I have a letter here that Pat Robertson sent off. I want to read a paragraph from that letter to see if this is what you're talking about. This apparently was sent to over 1,000 people around the state of Iowa by Pat Robertson. And it says, the feminist agenda is not about equal rights. It's about a socialist, anti-family political movement that encourages women to leave their husbands, kill their children, practice witchcraft, destroy capitalism, and become lesbians.
That's pretty crazy, if you ask me. Quite an agenda, I would say, for any one small amendment to accomplish. And that's
none of those things are even in the amendment that we had up on the screen earlier.
No, not at all. Obviously, one of the motivations, I think, in throwing all those issues in, simply to complicate the issue and obscure the facts. And that's really what they're trying to accomplish with this. We're not going to let them accomplish that, but that's what they're trying to do, is obscure the real impact, the positive impacts of what state ERAs have had across the country and what one will have here in the state of Iowa. I think what they're trying to do is motivate people to go and vote at the polls on Election Day out of fear and out of mistrust, not out of a good understanding of how Iowa law works or why it's important that we value women and give them first-class citizenship and ensure constitutional equality for them. And that's a problem. They are doing quite a bit of organizing and mailing and raising money to launch as aggressive a campaign as I suppose they're able to do to discredit what so many Iowans believe in. This is not a far-out thing. There are Republicans and Democrats alike who support this issue, younger voters, older voters, all sorts of people. People like Mary Louise Smith, the former chairman of the Republican National Committee. She's, I don't think has ever contemplated doing any of those things, leaving her husband or killing her children, and presumably if she did kill her children, we would have heard about it by now. And so clearly, when people like Mary Louise Smith and Representative Jim Leach and Senator Tom Harkin and Chuck Gifford from the UAW and the Iowa Federation of Labor and the Iowa Nurses Association, all these groups and individuals have endorsed this amendment. They believe in it because they believe in the simple equality that it would secure for women. And so that's, I think, the best answer to this statement of Pat Robertson's. It's obviously utterly ridiculous, and it's a shameful, I think, reflection on the tactics that they're willing to go to advance their very limited agenda, I think, or the population they represent is very limited, I think, versus all of the Iowans who actually support this amendment.
He certainly has hit all the notes, if you will, of things that would possibly alienate Iowa voters.
Certainly.
But there doesn't seem to be any relationship between the amendment and what he's saying.
No.
Anybody can establish.
No, none at all. And that's certainly been, the best place to go when you're looking for facts is what's happened in other states with these equal rights provisions. And there are 16 of them.
Good question. As long as you're asking the questions, what has happened in other
right.
states?
Well, I think that's an important thing. What has happened is that women have successfully been able to get paid equally for the work that they do, and that's an important thing, I think, in the private sector and the public sector for women who are working hard to support their families, not leave them or not kill them by any means, but to support their families, to get paid for the work they do. They've been able to accomplish that. Girls who've wanted to play softball or soccer have received money to do that, which they might not ordinarily have under certain kinds of programs in state Title IX programs and federal Title IX programs. So that's an important thing. I think girls should have equal opportunity in athletic development to fulfill their potential. Obviously, we saw some Olympic runners from the state of Iowa, and so we know we do very well in interscholastic sports, but we need to do better. I think we can do better in making sure that if there's some small rural school district out there, that and if there's money in the budget, that those girls be able to play whatever team on whatever sport they're interested in playing.
Certainly, the U.S. Olympic team would have been much poorer had we not had our women athletes.
Correct. I mean, we've got to
winning the gold medals for
pay
us.
attention to making sure that those skills are being developed at an early age.
Who believes this kind of stuff, though? I mean, is this kind of attack campaigning, does it work?
I think very few people actually believe it. I mean, it's hard to believe that anyone would kill their husbands, or kill their children and get away with it. I mean, that's pretty cockamamie. I think what it accomplishes is it makes the issue controversial before we even begin to discuss it. And so people fear getting down to the truth and figuring out really what's going on. And I think my fear is that people won't so much believe it, but they'll be confused by it, and so they're not going to be sure what to think or what to believe, and so they're going to stay away from the polls on Election Day, which of course will be a travesty because these laws which affect us, it's important for us all to be involved in voting them in and taking.
Stopping a vote is almost as good as changing a vote, isn't it? I mean,
absolutely.
What do you have to do to win? Do you need a large majority or just
We just need a simple majority, 50.01% of the vote. I'm assuming based on the strength now that the Des Moines Register did a poll, I think in January, December, and there have been other surveys that have been done. A strong majority of Iowans currently support
How strong a majority are the numbers coming back?
A significant majority, over 2/3 of Iowans support this, and that's not just 2/3 of women. That's 2/3 of men and women and Republicans and Democrats and people who align themselves no party in the state, and that's a significant thing to remember.
Rural voters, urban voters, whatever.
Across all spectrums and age categories, and I think that's important because what we'll probably see is some erosion of that support, but it's not going to be because people discover the true agenda behind this Equal Rights Amendment, because there's not any. What's going to happen is that Phyllis Schlafly and Pat Robertson and others are going to bombard voters, I'm afraid, with a very persuasive, fear-based campaign, probably right in the last 3 or 4 weeks, who knows how long. Obviously, they're starting their tactics already, so we can't fool ourselves into thinking they'll put it off to the end. And they'll try to complicate the issue so much and inject so much fear into the campaign that support that we now enjoy will be eroded. And so one of the things that we're trying to do with this campaign, and there are a number of other groups who are working hard on this in the state as well, is to educate voters, to give them the text of the amendment in its simple form, because I think once a person reads it and says, oh, that's all it is, you know, it's adding women to this Constitution, they're going to have doubts about this stuff that Robertson and Schlafly are saying.
We do need to take a break. Stay tuned. We'll be right back with Cindy Terrell from the Women's Equality Campaign.
The fact of the matter is, the most dangerous thing most people will ever face in the water is the water.
When you want great videos, it's time to go to Movies to Go, your 10,000 tape superstore. That's 10,000 movies, videos, and Nintendo games. Open 10 a.m. to midnight, 7 days a week. There's always something fun to watch at Movies to Go. Free lifetime memberships, 3 evening rentals, more copies of new releases. Movies to Go is 10,000 times the fun. With 5 video superstores in Des Moines, there's one near you.
Believe it, Des Moines is the new style American city. Dan Hungerford believes it.
We moved back to Des Moines because it has excitement, the best people, and the schools that we want our children to attend.
Kathy Broderick, who moved back from Washington, D.C., believes it.
My commute is shorter, traffic is friendlier. Seasons change here, but not friends and neighbors.
Julie Joyce is a believer.
I love Des Moines because of one symphony, 2 rivers, 3 miles of skywalks, and over 400,000 neighbors.
Believe it.
You made it!
Hey, I couldn't have gotten through physics without you.
Yeah, well, you're on your own at college.
It's not fair.
That's all right. I'm gonna get a job, you know, start working, I'm gonna save. And I'll be in college in another year or 2.
Like.
So, what do you have planned, Mike?
I think I'm gonna go home and make a sandwich. It's okay, man.
Support the United Negro College Fund. A mind is a terrible thing to waste.
Welcome back to Iowa Inquiry. I'm Rich Eichner. My guest is Cindy Terrell, the Executive Director of the Women's Equality Campaign. Cindy, we were talking before the break about the Pat Robertson attack letter which went out. There certainly has been some news coverage of that event. What kind of reactions are you getting from people around the state as they read about these charges that Reverend Robertson has presented against the ERA?
Well, I've been very heartened, frankly, by the response. In fact, I got a call from the Cherokee Daily Times, someone who just seen the letter and was so outraged he wanted to do a story on it. And we've heard reports from small towns and big towns alike that the story that was published in the Des Moines Register and editorialized actually against the letter as shenanigans, again, of Pat Robertson and the opposition as inappropriate, were picked up across the state. And I think that's heartening. Supporters of the Amendment Number 1 were on TV in the Quad Cities and were on TV in Cedar Rapids. And so TV stations and radio stations and the print media alike, I think, have been appalled by the letter and the inference of the letter that somehow or other this is about something that it's clearly not, and have been responding.
I've had some people think it's so ridiculous that they don't have to respond to it. Is that a wise political move to just ignore it?
Well, no, it's certainly not a wise political move. I think we've learned our lesson from the experience of Iowa in 1980, which was the last time that the Equal Rights Amendment was on the ballot here in Iowa. And the opposition launched a very similar campaign. What they did was connect the Equal Rights Amendment provision to everything. They said that it was going to mean that unisex toilets were going to be mandatory and that homosexual marriages would be mandatory. And they connected with all sorts of things, of which, of course, there was no connection, to which, of course, there was no connection. And I think one thing that can happen in an election when people feel like there's the majority of support, here I've been talking about how the majority support is complacency can build, and people can think, well, I don't have to worry about it. These people are so far to the right and so crazy and are making such appalling accusations that it's nothing that I have to worry about. And that's just the wrong reaction. Unfortunately, a lot of voters out there who don't have access to other sources of information may well believe Phyllis Schlafly and Pat Robertson because they're not giving any other information, and so they may be somewhat fearful. Everyone fears what they're not familiar with and what they don't know, and so they may well feel apprehensive about voting for this. And that's why I think it's so important that we remember, one, that people do support this, but it takes a lot of work to pass something as momentous as this. And it takes people being involved at the community level, reminding people when you're overhearing perhaps a conversation in a coffee shop about this crazy amendment that's going to make women kill their husbands, that to speak up and say, hey, that's not true. You know, does that make sense to you? It doesn't make sense to me. I can't see how that would happen. Surely all these important people wouldn't be favoring it if it actually accomplished that. So that's one important thing, I think, that we all who have a basic sentiment of feeling favorable toward equality need to do, is we need to speak up and speak out in our workplace or in social settings or in the home.
Is that happening? Are you getting just waves of support coming in?
Well, yeah. You know, waves is always a little bit of an exaggeration in any campaign season, particularly in the summertime. But yeah, we are. I know that there are a whole number of efforts that are going on across the state to do grassroots fundraising and education efforts. We are planning a big Walk for Equality next Saturday on the 29th of August, and that's something that we've gotten terrific response to. People are signing up to walk and are pledging money. We've got walks planned in Muscatine and in Iowa City and Cedar Falls and Cedar Rapids and Des Moines, and they're going to do one in Ames and one in the Quad Cities, though perhaps in a few weeks later. And that's something that I'm pleased to say I've hardly had to organize those, because the local coalitions are so strong, and they're made up of people from the library and from the YWCA and the League of Women Voters and the
all the
United
witchcraft
Church
organizations.
of Christ, right? All the people who are want to kill their children. And those are strong coalitions, and we're seeing some letters to the editor. That's another important thing that people can do. If you feel strongly about this amendment and you understand the need to give equality to women in the Constitution, then write a letter to the editor. That's something that I think a lot of people pay attention to and read. We were talking earlier about one of the real advantages of the state of Iowa is that people take time to read the newspaper and to listen to information they're given, and so that means we have a real opportunity to share information on the facts about the Equal Rights Amendment campaign. There are a lot of brochures floating around the state. There are a lot of small business cards with the text of the amendment printed on them for distribution at state fairs and county fairs and at events happening all around. That's one thing that we have been trying to provide the resources for people who march, say, in the 4th of July parade, and we're again doing it for the Labor Day parade, trying to provide people with banners and with stickers and balloons. And the basic message is pretty simple. The message that we've used on most of our things, and it's coming out on all of our, as I say, balloons, bumper stickers, banners, is equality for men in Iowa. Vote yes on equality for men and women in Iowa.
No, you're doing it. They've gotten through to you.
Equality for men in Iowa, men and women in Iowa, vote yes on Amendment number 1, and it's that simple. And that's something, if people are interested in distributing brochures or going door to door in their neighborhood, that's something that we're really encouraging this fall.
Mm-hmm. What are the biggest needs? I mean, you've talked about a range of issues, but are there a few things on your wish list that you'd really like to see in the next few weeks?
Well, I think that basic kind of grassroots education network is something that's very important. Talking to your local church or your Rotary Club or your Kiwanis or your Lions Club or your civic organization of one sort or another, calling the campaign, and the number is 515-244-4349, and we can tell you the contact in your community, in your county, who's working, who could provide you with brochures and materials if you wanted to speak to your own group. I think taking it to the community where you live and work is probably the most important thing that you can do to help. And then to become active and involved in additional ways, to write a letter to the editor maybe once a week on the issue. I think one thing that people sometimes forget about letters to the editor is that it's not always only important if they get printed, but the editors actually read them, and you make a statement to the editor of the paper, and that's an important thing. And
tell us a little bit more about the Walk for Equality. You said it's in a number of cities around the state.
That's correct.
Do people know where to show up in those communities? And also, is Western Iowa involved? I didn't hear Western Iowa City.
Well, let's see. They are going to do one in Sioux City, but I think later on. There's a coalition there, and they're going to pull one together for I think after Labor Day at some point. And there has been talking of doing one in Council Bluffs. We actually have a great contact in Red Oak as well, who a neat woman who's been doing a lot of visibility efforts for us. And what we're trying to do in those is recruit a lot of volunteers so they get involved and they get information on the event. We've been calling off of lists such as the Iowa Commission on the status of women. So some pretty straightforward lists of men and women who support equality, and asking them to collect pledges on behalf of the campaign, small pledges, 50 cents a kilometer or 10 cents a kilometer or $1 a kilometer. So it's also a money-raising effort. We obviously need to raise funds to launch our own media campaign and promote our issue with brochures and literature and all that sort of thing.
Why is media so important? You mentioned 1980. Did media have a very visible impact in 1980?
Yes, a resounding role, really. In the last several days of the campaign, the opposition acquired a huge amount of television and radio media and just blasted the airwaves with an inordinate amount of misleading information. And there's not that much you can do on November 2nd, if the election's the next day, to refute that. So what we need to be doing now is carefully and thoughtfully building up people's understanding of what this amendment will do for them, so that they're almost inoculated by the time they get to the polls on election day, and they only have to withstand maybe 2 or 3 weeks of that negative election campaigning by Schlafly and Robertson, but it's going to happen.
Do you think that's what's happening this year, is that people are getting inoculated, or that they're really just not focusing on this election yet?
Well, I think there's so much happening at the national level, obviously with the conventions and with quite a bit going on. I think this is something that a good number of Iowans are concerned about. Certainly we've had a good number of small contribution checks. You know, that's always a good indication of whether people are paying attention. If they manage to get at their checkbook and write us a check, they probably are paying attention enough. But that needs to happen much more than is happening now.
Where's the opposition money coming from?
Primarily the Eagle Forum, which is a national-based group out of Illinois. Phyllis Schlafly is the president of it, and she is a leader in the very right-wing element of the Republican Party. The Concerned Women for America, which is...
Sounds like a legitimate group.
Well, you would hope so, but no, they're headed up by Beverly LaHaye and her husband Tim LaHaye, who I believe is a televangelist in San Diego, one of these Jim Baker types, the folks who take a lot of money from a lot of believing people. And then Pat Robertson and the Christian Coalition, which people here in Iowa are familiar with because they've recently become quite dominant in the Republican Party here in Iowa, and I think are trying to manipulate voters by putting out as much misinformation about this amendment as possible. And the Christian Coalition is not only strong here in Iowa, but strong nationally. And that's where the majority of money is coming from. I believe after... It's
not being raised locally in Iowa, is what you're saying.
No, after much delay in the opposition reporting their funds, of course, there's a campaign disclosure process here in the state of Iowa, and they delayed and delayed and delayed and finally reported what they'd raised, and I think it was $79,000 in the period from January till May, and I think 588 of that.
Out of $9,000?
Which was 25 and over, but that, significant portion was from Iowa. So that's a very, very small fraction of money that they've gotten in state. So in effect, they're trying to get right-wing fanatics from across the country to decide the fate of Iowa citizens, and I think
whether Iowans are equal or not.
Right. I think that's a real travesty.
Unfortunately, we're out of time. Give your telephone number one more time if people want to.
515-244-4349. The headquarters is in Des Moines, and we have offices and groups working hard all over the state.
Okay. Well, Cindy, thanks for being with us and bringing us up to date on the campaign, and good luck come November.
Thank you.
Okay. Thank you for tuning in. Tune in every Friday night at 5 o'clock, Sunday mornings at 11:30 a.m. I'm Rich Eichner. Thanks for watching.